It's not meditative in a meditative sense, but it is a kind of knowing state without consciously, methodically thinking through things. I'm able to pull the resources I need to do what I want to do. I'm Julia Colmenares, and I'm a painter and a printmaker. I'm originally from California. I have a studio in East London, and I do printmaking at Thameside Studios in London. My background was originally in illustration. I studied in San Francisco and then continued my studies in France and then finally the UK. A state of livingness, what is it? It is it's emotion, it's feelings, it's being alive. And I think it's all those things. I think maybe it is living in the moment. Maybe it is what people always talk about as being mindful. I'm not sure it is, but it is getting into a particular state where you are very focused on the one thing that you're doing at that moment, but without baggage of the future or the past or anything else, that you are simply in that moment. Maybe it's that. And I think that sense of livingness, I think the painting has it as well, in a sense that at some point, once the painting leaves my hands, it has its own life that's going to be interpreted by someone else. And some of that livingness might come from the color, it might come from the materiality of the painting itself, it might come from, a lot of things, the content. And the livingness, coming back to that idea of livingness too, I think that also relates to nature and our connection to that, and it sort of swings all the way back to the landscape again, and maybe why I've really become quite attracted to that, to nature and that connection that maybe in the past I'd forgotten somewhat. I started doing landscapes around the time of the pandemic. I spent quite a lot of time outdoors, as many people did, walking or exploring. At the time, I just moved to a new flat in East London, so I was out every day with the amazing weather we had. In the particular area I lived in, there was an incredible walled garden from the 18th century. So I was incredibly interested in getting into that garden, but I wasn't allowed in, and I couldn't seem to get permission. So that sort of occupied my thoughts, and so I began to do quite a lot of drawings, and I took a lot of photographs of that particular landscape, of just the park. Epping Forest is very close as well. And as a result of that, I began to think quite a lot about landscape in general, and how landscape, I suppose in my own past or my own experiences, thinking back to things that I could bring out, or actually that landscape did have an importance to me that I hadn't really thought about. So it was just that reconnection to nature at that point that sparked that interest. I think the figure is sort of a natural progression for me to come back to the figure, because some of my training as an illustrator involved quite a lot of figurative drawing as well as character drawing. I think there's a challenge to it, and also some of the things that I'm interested in, some of the research, or some of the type of sort of cultural detritus, I don't know what you want to call it, but things like horror films, as well as art theory, gender, feminine sublime, all sorts of different types of subjects interest me. And I think the figure just seems a logical progression. I don't really want the figure to be any kind of a set portrait. In some cases, it's quite fragmentary, and that's probably because the interests I have are also quite fragmentary. There is probably a thread that runs through all those interests, but it's not an obvious thread. And I also think that's maybe an interesting part of the challenge of trying to bring the figure into a landscape or in some kind of interaction with the landscape, that it allows, it imposes some sort of meaning because it sits somewhere between being abstract ideas maybe and representation. And I think viewers can often like representation because they think they can understand it. So it's more of an implied narrative, but it very much falls upon the viewer. So that figure, I suppose, is just a placeholder. It might have personal resonance for me, but maybe it's something that when someone sees that in the context of the painting, they can also transfer their own ideas upon it and interpret it as it is. Really, it's I think that's always the case with the painting anyway. Maybe because I've settled in the UK, that I do think back on my identity as an American as well. So I think back to my youth or my childhood or what have you. And within that kind of reflection, I think about some of the subjects I was interested in at the time. And I think those reappear in my work now. Things like myth or magic realism, because I used to read quite a lot of sort of Latin American authors in my 20s. And I read a lot of psychology and Carl Jung and kind of symbolism. I was really interested in that. And I wouldn't say that I'm reading that per se at the moment, but I think those things are still present. And so it's sort of circling back into the work in some manner, maybe slightly surreal, or and that sort of fits with the kind of, I think, fragmentary imagery that I put into the work, that it's not logical per se. It doesn't make sense. I'm an immigrant here now, but in the States, I'm obviously American, but because I have my background, my parents, there's a different, my dad was an immigrant and so on. So my own background is quite mixed up in a sense of different types of, I suppose, cultural identities. And when I was young, I experienced different aspects of that because half of my family was Latin and the other half Californian, and then Norwegian, my grandfather. So it's all, they're very contrasting cultures. And so I think that aspect of these different cultural things overlapping, I think that comes into my work in lots of ways, that I might be interested in some sort of European painting, but then I'll be reading something that might have to do with folklore or myth. There's Native American in my background from California that I'm also had experiences with when I was young. So, and that really, I think that part embraces the landscape quite a lot because of the particular area that I spent quite a lot of holidays when I was young with one half of my family. And so perhaps the curiosity about each one of those cultures that seemingly is so different to one another, that still feeds into my work and probably has fueled a lot of the different research or reading, or whatever you want to call it, reading about Native American myths or even Greek mythology or Nordic mythology, Latin American gods and mythology and mixtures of it's all quite a jumbled bag. I think, well, the people in terms of representation, that they might be modeled on people I know, possibly. Sometimes they might have to do with a particular story or narrative or myth. Like in a recent painting, I have parts of a myth of Callisto and Artemis, which the story is more or less that Artemis, one of her goddesses or one of her maidens, who's supposed to be chaste, is not chaste, and she falls pregnant, and so she has displeased the goddess, and Artemis is also Diana, and so she turns her into a bear, which, for whatever reason, I'm sort of attracted to that particular myth. And then I think about these kind of myths of creation, especially the Native American ones that often have animals. So there's definitely crossovers. And then that kind of swings back to someone like Carl Jung, who talked a lot about myths and how there's a universalism within different myths and different cultures. And the thing about myth is they try to explain things that are unexplainable or offer some sort of interpretation. And I think that's interesting, or it's a way of maybe navigating the uncertainty that's always present and has always been present just in everyday life, things that occur or that are good or bad or what have you. I do like to think of myself as just being a painter, because when I'm working or if I'm doing print, I'm really very much consumed by the material aspects of making the work, and somehow losing myself in that process and responding to the materials on the surface, how I move things around. And I don't think that I'm sort of contextualizing those other things that I'm interested in at that moment. It might be that afterwards I could look at it and maybe analyze it or think about what was I thinking, because I think that there's two different processes at work when you make art, is that the more intuitive, direct response. And even in the planning of things, that you might plan something, but in the process, things can change. And having an openness to that change. So, I think that, again, there's not any kind of literal tie to those things. It may be at one point I was making large prints of flowers, but that was sparked slightly by the idea of women painting flowers, because when I was young and I first studied art, I thought, I'm not going to paint flowers and I'm not going to do watercolors, because that is sort of deemed a feminine activity, and which is rubbish, because now I do those things. I use watercolors, I paint flowers, and I realize that it could be a lot more powerful than in the sense of maybe women given that only that opportunity to paint from manuals, sort of by rota, like certain ways of painting flowers in Victorian times. So we're in a different time now, but I have found those things stimulating nonetheless. Yes, I think what I mentioned about the material, I think there's, I guess, different things that it's not always an immediate thing when I start working, but I try very much to create the condition for it, meaning that I have enough time in the studio, that I often play music, and I hate to say always, but probably it is always, because it does help me to tune out and just to focus on what I'm doing. And I have to say that it's that point when I'm so immersed with what I'm doing, whether I'm mixing paint or slapping it on the canvas, that I really am not connected to some of those thoughts I was speaking of before. It's very much intuitive, and I would say things that come out are much more spontaneous, and there is a sense of timelessness or non-temporality where it's that kind of moment where time can go by a few hours without even noticing it. And at that point, I probably don't hear the music. And it's an important part of my process because of my own background and training as an illustrator, which normally requires a lot of planning and preparatory sketches for clients. I don't want to know entirely where I'm going. I like to work that out when I'm on the canvas. I may have some ideas, I may have done some drawings or sketches, or I may have things nearby that I'm looking at. But I think when it starts to work is when I'm no longer looking at those things, and most of what's happening is directly on the canvas or the plate. My own visual language, which is sort of becoming more and more consolidated, is very much about a gestural mark. And so for me to do a gestural mark, it's not just that I'm not throwing paint like Jackson Pollock, but I want the mark to be spontaneous. I don't want to overwork the painting. So again, that ties in with me not wanting to over-prepare or do a lot of... I don't want to replicate a sketch onto a painting. I might do a really crude sketch so that I save a lot of the discovery for the painting. And I want the marks that I make to be uncontrived and to somehow have that be conveyed in the mark when you see the mark. In some cases, there's a lot of risk involved with that way of working, in the sense that some people like to have many things worked out so that they can execute the painting. But I enjoy those risks. I think that they probably bring me greater things, because even if I lose a certain part of the painting, that eventually when I'm able to resolve it, or even if I have to chuck it and start again, something else has been attained through that process. I mean, maybe the painting is trying to, again, it's like it has its own living, it has its own life. Maybe it's trying to make sense of all the different stimulus that I'm taking in at the same time, and that interests me, and for whatever reason I think is important, that that painting is helping me to make sense of it in some sort of way, and hopefully a pleasing way, that it can be weird or strange, but then there's other things like the material and the color and things that make it interesting to look at, or that move you through the painting, or make you ask why, because it's not important, you know, who the figure is or why the figure's in there, but it makes you sort of question it and think, well, that's interesting. I have no idea what it means, but, you know, what could that mean? Maybe what kind of meaning might that hold? So I think it's that idea of, meaning, expression, you know, maybe it's a link. The beginning stage is always the most exciting, and probably the stage that I'm the most free at. And then it's finishing the painting is where other things happen, and there's more problem solving. Sometimes I look back at the beginning stages because I photographed the painting along the way, and I think sometimes there's something in that early stage that maybe I need to leave too as well, because it might be cruder in terms of lots of things, color, composition, but there's something quite truthful in the marks, or something quite truthful in the way it's been put down. If I've just used a sponge and half an hour laid down some sort of structure for the painting to be built upon, sometimes that's interesting. So my process with monoprinting, I think it's a meeting point between drawing and painting. I work on a metal plate, and rather than working only additively to the plate, so taking a brush and painting onto the plate, I work reductively. So I tend to always start with, instead of a blank canvas, I have a completely inked plate. The plate is metal, so I also don't trace imagery. So some people use Perspex, so they can see through and they can put it on an image or a drawing they've done and work from that. Again, there's that thing about the unknown or what's going to happen on the plate. And so I work sort of, I feel it's like drawing, but it's like drawing in reverse because I'm working reductively, removing areas of light to reveal edges of tonality. And I also I will go back into it eventually with the brush, adding things, or I tend to use my hand. I don't use a lot of brushes when I'm doing the monoprint, so it's usually my hand and a rag. So maybe it's kind of like finger painting, sort of in the beginning, if you think about it, sort of removing, but having my hand with a rag on it. And for me, it's a very direct and a very rapid way of working. I think I can paint faster than I can draw if I think about painting. And at least where I'm at with the painting, I can quite quickly express something. The drawing, sometimes if I was doing just a regular drawing on a piece of paper, it might take me longer. So the monoprint is sort of a bit of both of those things. Adding, taking away, and very quickly being able to start expressing marks with the rag, and dragging some of the tone into other areas and creating new lines and marks with the rag itself. And I feel that this method is it's really it informs the painting I do.